long-term strategy. Commission co-chairman is Fred Eckley, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy.
Well, thank you for being here this morning, and just to let you know a little bit of a background, a year ago today, the Secretary of Defense announced the formation of an independent bipartisan federal commission who was charged with studying U.S. defense strategy far into the future. The need for the effort was based on the premise that a coherent long-term strategy must take into account future threats and opportunities and to guide U.S. research and acquisition. The Commission on Integrated Long-Term Strategy today presented its report to President Reagan, and the Commission members are with us today to discuss their recommendations. As a little bit in the way of guidelines, please, this will be a single subject on the record briefing. After some initial comments, we'll open the floor to questions. You recognize, I'm sure, most of the panel members and probably familiar with them. We would like to ask you to, after Dr. Eckley has made his opening statement, that your questions be directed to Dr. Eckley. He will either then, for the sake of efficiency and timeliness, either give you the answer or direct the answer to one of the Commission members. So if we can follow that, I would appreciate it. So I'd like to introduce to you at this time Dr. Fred C. Eckley, who's the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, who is the official government representative to and the co-chairman of the Commission. Dr. Eckley.
Thank you, and we are pleased to meet with you this morning. All but 3 members of our 13-member commission are present. Secretary Kissinger, Judge Clark, and Professor Lederberg could not be with us at this briefing session with you. We have just met with the President in the Cabinet room this morning. We were joined there by the Vice President, Secretary Carlucci, and the National Security Advisor, General Powell. And we are pleased to respond to your question here. My colleague and co-chairman, Albert Wohlstetter, you might want to make an initial point still.
No, I think I'll just wait for questions, Fred. Let's see.
We want to give you more time, you see.
you like, I can say it's something about the sense of the report as a whole. It's very hard to summarize in a sentence a report that covers a very wide range of conflicts and policy towards them, ranging from the lowest intensity and most probable to the nuclear and most apocalyptic and least likely. We've thought of several sort of bumper stickers that you could have, that you could use, but they just could suggest part of it. Better aim for a buck is one that's kind of, or keep your head, don't threaten to lose it. But there isn't any one single sentence a summary of it. Perhaps the thing that is unique about it is that it was not only a very comprehensive look, look at the long haul and the long-term changes that have been taking place, but that tried to fit together the elements of strategy concerning this very wide range of dangers.
Keep your head, don't threaten to lose it is an important element of this discriminate deterrence strategy that we have worked on.
How do you fit the term discriminate deterrence in with some of the other phrases that have been used over the last 30 years to describe nuclear strategy? With like various strategies that have been employed. What's different today?
We see it as a way of keeping flexible response viable into the next century. Some people use the word extended deterrence to describe the American nuclear guarantee. We see this as a way of keeping the American nuclear guarantee to our alliance viable over the next 20 years.
There's been some criticism of the report already, in the sense that you've raised some issues, cast doubt on some strategies, which are part of the broader alliance strategy, without really offering anything in place and without having consulted with the Allies, or some people say without adequately consulting with the State Department. I wonder if you could address these issues.
It wouldn't be a worthwhile report if there were not a little bit of criticism. It wouldn't have much to say. It's a sign that it has something to say. We have had discussions with the Allies throughout last year on an informal basis because this report was in development, and Professor Wohlstetter may want to add to that. He has had extended discussions. And we have, of course, informed the State Department way back in 1986 and have since then had an informal liaison at the very senior level in the State Department as we worked on this report. Do you want to add about the Allied consultation?
Yes, well, the members of the panel, as I think you'll recognize, are all have been very concerned with our allies, and very conscious of their sensitivities, as well as the long-term strategy that we've had. And I, for example, myself, have spent a great deal of time in Paris and other capitals, talking with officials and high experts, and this was formed very consciously with their sensitivities in mind. The comments that Bob, that you cite, I think are just mistaken. Some junior person in a specific region in the State Department who perhaps heard of extended deterrence last year is under the impression that discriminate deterrence is incompatible with it. It's quite the contrary. We're talking about making our guarantee credible and keeping it credible, and threats to commit suicide are not credible. Moreover, that was not the way our guarantee began. In fact, the whole concept of extended deterrence in some ways is misleading in the sense it suggests that there is some other sort of a deterrence. But our strategic force was designed from the beginning to deter and respond to an invasion in Europe. And we've been very conscious of this as a continuing one of the durable aspects of American strategy, but which can be implemented now in an increasingly persuasive way, given some of the transformations that have taken place in technology.
Since this is such an important point that was raised in Bob Toth's question, maybe General Goodpasture, you may want to add to it.
I think we tried to make very clear the importance of continuing our forward deployments in the areas of the world that are of outstanding importance, and of course Europe has to be in that top group. I myself have devoted, and I'm still devoting, a great deal of my time and effort to the support of NATO, and I was gratified that our group shared my view shared the view that the continued support of NATO through a combination of conventional and nuclear capabilities in place, that continued support remains very vital. And for both the conventional and the nuclear forces, we propose a combination of defensive and offensive systems. And it seems to me, and I think to my colleagues, that should provide continued deterrence and reassurance in Europe, and as we look over the period of the next 2 decades, as our study was concerned with.
Other questions?
Mr. Secretary, why does your report fail to endorse or even address the subject of the competitive strategies doctrine?
a correction. The report addresses the competitive strategy explicitly. I cannot give you the page number now, but if you can find it, we'll find it for you.
There's a chapter. No, there's a chapter.
Well, there's a paragraph which mentions it.
One of the findings is that
But you're right. It is related. I mean, the spirit of your question is a good one, and it's mentioned there.
one of your findings is that we should have more of an emphasis on conventional weapons, that conventional weapons, new technology that makes it possible not to use nuclear weapons in some cases. But we learned during the INF treaties that the conventional weapons are a lot more expensive than nuclear weapons. How can we afford to pay for this new technology?
Well, we have given a great deal of consideration to the budget constraints and the question of priorities. Maybe General Vesey, you want to comment on that?
Well, the strategy document's not a programming document. It's a direction for the nation over the next 20 years. And the nation will have to provide adequate defense from whatever resources it decides to put into it. And the hope of the Commission is that the strategy document will provide a direction and some system of priorities for evaluating programs that are raised for the defense of the nation over the next 20 years.
Just an additional point, maybe
Yes.
Albert Wolstetter?
Yes, I'd add to what General Vesey said that if you have what General Vesey calls only to whom it may concern munitions, you need an awful lot of them. But if you can hit what you aim at, you can keep costs in bounds. This affects logistics, it affects a great many other things. It also affects discriminateness, and that's very important in conventional as well as nuclear war.
Dr. Eclay, perhaps some of the question that Bob raised, perhaps some of the controversy in this report is not so much whether the United States helps its allies, but whether the allies continue to help the United States. For instance, you all seem to raise the question about NATO refusing to act outside of its direct sphere of responsibility. What about that? Are we calling on the allies to help us in other areas of the world where we seem to be policing regional conflicts? And
We stress the importance of sharing the risks of making bases available to each other and of facilitating access to areas such as the Persian Gulf, which are vital to all of the allies.
in these what you refer to as informal consultations with the allies, how do they feel about this? What was their reaction to this?
Yes. There has been, as you know, a long drift in NATO about which there's been some reluctance to deal with anything out of area, as it's in the jargon. But frequently people talk of out of area as if it was out of outer space, as if it was something that the Allies had no interest in at all, and it was just one indiscriminate other. But in fact, there are some parts of the world where allies have differing interests and conceive their interests in different ways from ours. And Asia, in Central America, and so on. But there are some parts of the world where we have clear common interests, as in the Persian Gulf, in which their interests are more direct and massive than our own. And in such cases, then many allies have been coming to recognize that sharing the risks as well as the burdens with us is a very reasonable thing.
And we did discuss this with the allies too, as you asked. Back there.
Dr. Clay, it has become clear that the NATO allies are not interested politically in spending a lot more money on conventional defense. That this is becoming politically untenable in many of the NATO countries. With the NATO allies wanting to spend less on conventional defense, can we assure that the conventional deterrent will be not a one-sided expenditure?
Well, that's an old story. There are a lot of countries that want to spend less on defense, conventional or nuclear, if they have nuclear forces. And our own Congress wants to spend somewhat less on defense, and that is a problem we have addressed, and the Commission recommends we should have a growth in our defense budget, and that applies to the allies as well, that is commensurate with our growth in the gross national product. That is to say, let us not cut further in the slice of our tax dollars or our national economy dollars that we devote to defense. Back there?
Is there any consideration of cutting back on commitments, on our commitments in the future? There seems to be a consensus developing that the future is going to be a time of austerity, that we're not going to be able to spend as much as we have been on defense, and one alternative would be to cut back on the places that we regard ourselves as being responsible for. Your report seems to keep us responsible for all the places that we have been in the past, but at less cost, and I don't see how, or at the same cost, but I don't see how that's squared.
We have given careful consideration to our commitments and our alliance structure. Maybe Dr. Brzezinski, you want to comment on this?
The commitments the United States has are based on a geostrategic assessment of U.S. interest, and these commitments have to be sustained. What we recommend is a more discriminating, a more flexible, and therefore a more effective way of sustaining these commitments. In our report, we have tried to take into account the likely geopolitical changes on the world scene over the next 20 years and the likely technological changes. And in the light of these two sets of changes, we recommend a strategic and a conventional posture by the United States, which we believe, in fact, enhances in the long range our capability to defend these commitments on the basis of a strategy of discriminate deterrence. That is to say, a strategy which gives us more choices, more flexibility, more selectivity, and last but not least, more mobility in terms of long-range reach.
John, could pass you one point on this?
Yes. I just add the point that one of our recommendations is to stress the importance of security assistance, and that would extend from such things as assisting in building the capability and intelligence capability, working with countries in their own interest, in the interest of sustaining their own national sovereignty, so that they can take some of the responsibility for providing for their own security.
All right. Some question back there.
Two questions. The first is with regard to support for anti-communist insurgencies. What did the Commission feel that we've been too shy about this in the wake of Vietnam? Can we step up our anti-communist aid? And secondly, what are the chances that these recommendations are going to be adopted?
Well, Congress, U.S. Congress, as you know, endorses in specific instances support to anti-communist insurgencies. And we in a Commission looking 20 years ahead simply wanted to point out that in selected cases, that is a very important instrument to be able not just to conduct defensively counteroffensives, but also to support insurgents in selected cases that are fighting for the same cause that lies in our own interest. That ties in with a broader theme about the relationship of offense and defense. I don't know whether, Professor Huntington, you want to put this in a larger context?
Well, I think certainly one of the major developments in recent years has been the generation of what seems to me to be a fairly broad consensus on the desirability of the United States having a policy which permits it to support anti-communist insurgencies. There has been broad bipartisan support in Congress for 3 out of the 4 current cases where we are doing that, and certainly the Commission wanted to, as Fred indicates, argue that this is an option which we should continue to maintain in the future.
Mr. Huntington, you were Professor Huntington. You
I
mentioned,
take your question.
The question is, Professor Huntington mentioned that there had been broad congressional support for 3 out of the 4 programs. But the one program, Aid to the Contras, has generated such controversy and led to this Irangate so-called scandal.
Right.
Do you really think in the future this strategy that you recommend can be successfully implemented? And another thing on the companion recommendation of increased and expanded security assistance. would that, do you think, entail cutting back on aid to Israel and Egypt? Because you mentioned that they had such a high percentage of the current aid.
Right. I'll answer both your questions. The issue of Nicaragua and Central America has been addressed by another commission, the Kissinger Commission. They've done a superb job, and we felt that this is a current issue. We don't have to deal with it for the long term. Dr. Brzezinski told me he had to leave earlier. He's not leaving because of not leaving because of your question. And second, on security assistance, that's addressed really to the 101st Congress, the next Congress. That there have to be fewer restrictions which make less efficient the dollars that have been allocated, and that there have to be larger allocations, because on the margin that's one of the most effective ways of spending a national security dollar. Question here.
Two questions in point of fact. First of all, in looking at the need for mobility, the increased need for mobility that you cite, while your report does project ahead for 20 years, were you conscious that, of some situations of the recent past that where we were at a material disadvantage because of the absence of this kind of mobility? And if so, I wonder which they were.
Well, we had difficulties in getting certain difficulties in getting to Libya in a recent incident. But again, this is a forward-looking commission. I'd rather not review the past incidents. I don't know whether Admiral Holloway, for example, would want to add anything forward-looking on this.
Well, I think the report does imply in several cases that naval forces will have a very active role in the strategy of the future because of the broader and perhaps more unpredictable areas around the world in which we may have to respond because of vital national concern. And I do think the report specifically says naval forces can be used under these circumstances. So I don't think that that's any change necessarily, but it does reaffirm the fact that we have a balanced defense establishment that ought to be able to handle the broadest range of threats to our security.
I had a second part of this in the strategic area. Rereading the Scowcroft Commission report of 1983 and comparing it with those parts of this document that deal with nuclear strategic issues, one would not even discern that we're talking about the same world. There's such a total lack of continuity in the issues addressed, the approaches to the problem, and I'm wondering whether the world has changed so much in 4 years, or whether it's simply the composition of these panels that changes.
There's more harmony there than your question indicates, but the Scowcroft Commission looked at the next few years, choices of missiles. We looked at the next 20 years, moving beyond these particular missiles. We have a question back there. Yeah.
One of the things you seem to be endorsing here is the development of additional non-strategic nuclear weapons, discriminatory weapons. In light of that, do you think it was a mistake to trade away the Glickums in the INF negotiations?
We do not address the INF agreement here, and the choices we're looking at for the next 20 years are not affected by that treaty.
I'd like to pass a question along to Admiral Holloway and Generals Goodfaster and Vesey, if I could. The report, I think, states that or suggests that we're obviously not going to be able to continue to willy-nilly buy big-ticket items like your big aircraft carriers and Trident submarines and all, and still put money into these smart weapons, developing these smart weapons. Are your big-ticket items going to have to go in the face of this? Or?
I will divert your question to the right, to Mr. Claytor.
We don't address that. We are looking at the long range, and we are not selecting weapon systems, nor are we deciding on whether or not we have to do one thing or another thing. We are saying that these things need to be done. Now, it will have to be decided by the Secretary of Defense, whoever he is at the time, whether or not it will be necessary to avoid building further big platforms or not. We are not addressing the
But
question.
don't you all have a feel for what we're going to be able to afford? And,
We may, well, we may or may not be able to afford both. If not, that decision will have to be made at the time, and we're not exercising a judgment on it, because this is a long-term thing in which we are not selecting weapons choices.
Question back there.
And
You put a lot of emphasis on these new, highly accurate conventional weapons. I'm just wondering why you think that these are feasible. I'm sure you recall that 5 years ago there was a whole series of programs under the label Emerging Technologies, ET weapons. All of those test programs ended in dismal failure. Several technical people that I've talked with lately say that nothing's really changed in the interim. The Defense Science Board in 1982 wrote a report that basically said you might as well forget about it. I mean, what do you see as the feasibility of these types of programs? And I'm wondering whether General Vesey, for example, sees them as an effective supplanter to conventional aircraft, tanks.
General Schriever has some experience in development of weapon systems, and Professor Wohlstetter will also comment on this.
Well, all I can say, let me talk about long-range missiles, for example. 20 years ago, we were laughed at when we talked about certain accuracies. We have actually achieved those accuracies and improved them by a factor of 3. And insofar as smart weapons are concerned, conventional weapons, there are a number of applications. That's another matter. I was director of what was called Project Forecast in 1963 and 64, and I had a gentleman who headed up the tactical panel, and he said, let's talk about HITLs instead of missiles. And in fact, we have achieved accuracies with conventional weapons that is highly classified, but the smart weapons we're talking about is achievable, I can assure you.
Albert? Well, the Defense Science Board had a summer study this summer, and much of it is unclassified, and it was on precisely this subject of the strategic uses of conventional weapons. And one of the things they mention is that you have 30-foot accuracies now with cruise missiles, and that you can get near zero inaccuracies, that is 1 to 3 meters in the future against fixed targets. So it's simply not true that these things haven't worked. And I would stress what General Schriever said, if you look at the changes over time, the most dramatic and least noticed have been the enormous improvements in accuracy. And an improvement by a factor of 10 in accuracy is equivalent to a change by a factor of 1,000 in the yield of weapons. So when you've had shifts from the 2 to 5 miles that people have thought of as that is 12,000 to 30,000 feet in the mid-50s, to 30 feet or 100 feet or 150 feet, you're talking about revolutionary changes.
Let me just ask a question of clarification. Are you talking about, attacking bridges and other fixed targets like that, or are you talking about as many talking about ET weapons 5 years ago? We're talking about going after moving tank columns, having special sensors that can distinguish them from automobiles that are...
Obviously, fixed targets are easier to hit, and for the longer term, we can, with the sensors, get the moving targets as well. There's a question back there.
According to the Commission's view, in the next 20 years, the Asian partners, especially China and Japan in specific...
Speak a little louder.
Yeah, according to the Commission's view, in the next 20 years, Japan and China in specific, Asian participant will be increasingly coming into the world arena. What led to your conclusion of their growing participant in world events? And secondly, if there's been a lot of talk about consulting with the NATO allies, is there a compatible consultation with the Asian ally, Japan in specific, and if maybe China?
Albert?
First, there has been discussion with Asian allies, for example, the Japanese, and as for the question as to why do we think that there may be a great deal more weight, and that some Asian countries may be even more major players. Partly this is based on the studies by the Future Security Environment Group, which looked at the course of economic development over time. Now, where it's clear that you're going to have China, or at least on the major projections, on the most likely cases, and Japan have a very much larger weight in the world. Now, whether this will be translated into military power is we don't know, but this is certainly a possibility. And whether we're talking about, and that will certainly have to be taken into account, because whether countries, as you get these new players, whether they're friendly or hostile, it does change things. That's a question there.
Decisions have to be taken very soon on the replacement of 2 aircraft carriers, 6 to 7 years down the road. It's getting into your 20-year time frame. But I'm not clear whether this report really helps anybody come to those decisions as to whether to fund it or not. On the one hand, you're saying we've got to go to less expensive platforms. On the other hand, you want to have greater mobility and flexibility. Could you address that question?
Maybe that's a question General Vesey already touched on it, and maybe Jack, you want to elaborate on your initial answer.
Well, it doesn't answer the Secretary of Defense can't look in here to page 25 and say yes or no, I should fund the 2 aircraft carriers. There are a number of other things that he has to consider as he does that. But what it does is give him some guidelines in looking at the direction that the nation will go in. But it goes back to some of the other points that were raised here earlier about what should you do about large platforms. Well, what you should do about large platforms is when you buy large platforms, understand that they are going to last a long time, and understand that in order to have large platforms be effective through this period, they have to be able to adapt to the technological changes that are likely to take place over the period.
I guess I'd like to just follow up on that, because it is, I think, a very, very important point. The platforms have just been getting more and more expensive, and they're introduced less and less frequently. The Air Force had 10 new fighters in the 1940s, 6 in the 1950s, 2 in the 1960s, 2 in the 1970s, and expects to have 1 in the 80s and 90s. Now, that means that we're going to have to adjust to the enormous changes in the security environment, but it's clear that you can't do it only in the platforms. So it's going to have to come in the smart things that are carried on platforms, including trained personnel, but as well as smart weapons. And the technology of training is going to be very important. And in the environment of the platforms, the intelligent environment, the sensors, the command, control, and communications. And intelligence has been a very important part of this study, and perhaps you may want to ask some questions about that.
There's a question here.
I realize that this is not a programmatic set of recommendations, but I'm wondering, we have a defense program now and another one for fiscal '89 that's in the final planning stages, and the current program does to some extent address all the areas touched on in this report, whether it's low intensity conflict or flexible platforms. If the JCS and the Secretary of Defense took this report entirely to heart and tried to build it into the defense program, would it be significantly different than the current defense program is?
I've discussed this with Secretary Carlucci, and I think it's more appropriate to think of this report as being relevant for the next 5-year plan, which we have to put together this coming year. The time left that we had after Congress finally finished its budget before Christmas, was so constrained that we had to do the best we could while running.
The report is obviously not a political, doesn't speak to the political document, but the undertone in this thing, you're asking Congress to let it take its meat hooks off of the foreign assistance program, give the president a freer hand. You're proposing the possibility of more commitment in peripheral wars, unconventional wars around the world. Congress and the American public apparently have been very reluctant to get involved in this kind of thing. Would you speak to the political changes that are going to be necessary to get Congress and the American public to support some of the programs that you envision?
Yeah, this is a good question, and it relates to the question of the timing. Why are we coming out now? Whom are we talking to? Congress and the political process you referred to. Maybe Ambassador Armstrong, and do you want to
Yes, I think
address this?
The timing is ideal. We've had continuity for 7 years now, and now, whatever is true about this confusing election, we're going to have a new administration come next year. So we think it is a perfect time and a new Congress to look ahead. One thing that hasn't been brought out too much in this is the integral role that better intelligence plays in this. And your point about third world conflict, yes, there has been a great deal of controversy here. Now, our report recognizes it and says we've got to get more unanimity or at least more convergence of opinion here to be effective. Once we are effective, here's one place where we think intelligence can help us be smarter, more precise, more accurate. And more flexible in the third world in sharing our intelligence knowledge with them, whether it's the spy satellites, the reconnaissance satellites, to give us a better fix on where we should be going with when we get into the details of program and those decisions that the next Congress is going to have to make, the next president, the next Secretary of Defense and State. So sure, we recognize there are plenty of areas of controversy here where either within this Congress or Congress and executive there's controversy. I think we recognize those. And we're giving a general blueprint that is bipartisan in nature and that has new ideas, new concepts, that leaves the details, and they're important details, up to future administrations and Congresses.
The report addresses conventional arms control as well as space arms control and points out that to the extent that one assumes a Soviet incentive for arms reductions for economic reasons, you have to look to conventional arms reductions because only there are the savings likely to be substantial. I'll break the rule and have one more question.
Yeah.
Back there.
On SDI, the report mentions it, but doesn't get into it very specifically. And I was curious, in the strategy, what role SDI would actually play, and is there any thought given to when a decision should be made for deployment and all of this, since this goes out over the next 20 years?
We have worked on this very carefully, and I don't know, Mr. Graham Plater, you want to?
SDI is not an issue here. What we are saying is that in maximizing our deterrent capability, some defense against nuclear missiles ought to be worked on. There is no, I don't think there is any difference of opinion that we need to continue to do research in this area, and that if we had some defense of missiles, of our own missile sites, it would enhance our deterrent capability, and we agree with that. The rest of this is, I think, an issue that has got to be dealt with in future administrations, and we don't take a decision on it.
And you note here we have a consensus report. I thought this might be like the John McLaughlin show, and I might have to cut off my colleagues mid-sentence. But again, we have underlined the consensus by this not being necessary. That's right. Somebody will say thank you.
Thank you very much.
been watching a briefing held today at the Pentagon on the release of a report on changes in U.S. security policy. This program will re-air on C-SPAN at about 3:05 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 12:05 Pacific.